Let's go to Ukraine. There was some fascinating new polling that has come out on Ukraine in the first major sign that Americans, and specifically independents and Republican voters, but an overall majority are beginning to turn against increased aid to Ukraine. So we made some custom graphics here to try and break everything down. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. This is the first question. Should the U.S. authorize additional funding to Ukraine? Yes, 44%. No, 55%. That's the first time, actually, that we've seen that number. This is actually really interesting, and I want to keep this up here for a little while. What type of assistance should the U.S. provide to Ukraine? 63% say intelligence gathering. 53% say military training. But then the majority drops off. Providing weapons, 43%, and a stunning only 17% say participation in military operations. And I've been yearning for something like this for a long time, Krystal, because one of the way that the Ukraine hawks will try and hijack the debate, they're like, well, the vast majority of Americans want to support Ukraine. I'm like, yeah, but to what extent and how? Like intelligence gathering, okay, sure. You know, even that gets a little sketchy whenever we're providing military targets inside of Russia, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
As you start to segregate it down, anything that involves like actual participation in kinetic events, people are like, not only no, but hell no. And then in terms of even supporting the overall war effort with actual like weapons and increased funding, Americans are really beginning to turn on that. So let's go to the next one. We have the partisan breakdown here. This is actually really interesting. We're talking about it before the show. Democrats on further support for Ukraine. Support for additional funding, supermajority, nearly 62%. The U.S. should do more, 61%. Go to the Republicans here. So then when we see Republicans on further support for Ukraine, vast majority, 71%, should not authorize funding. U.S. has done enough, 60%. But then we go to the next one. And this is where things are really odd. I worry that this war will continue without resolution. Democrats at 82%. And then actually Republicans and independents at 73 and 75 respectively. So Democrats are worried that the war will continue without resolution, but are also basically united in wanting to actually authorize even more aid for the war in Ukraine. So politically, people are kind of all over the map. Democrats are worried, but they want to send more weapons. But the big top line figure, independents, Republicans, overall majority, turn against increased actual military aid to Ukraine. And that flies in the face of what the administration is doing. Just 2 weeks ago, Biden promised actually more aid to Ukraine because the $100 billion or so apparently has not been enough. He just said, quote, "We will not waver." This was at the NATO summit. "We are going to help Ukraine build a strong, capable defense across land, air, and sea, which will be the force of stability in the region and deter against any and all threats." I think the American people are beginning to come to terms with what the reality of this type of rhetoric looks like. $100 billion is more than we gave the Afghan National Security Forces over 20 years. And I think we all know how that worked out. We've brought everybody stories here about how even the Ukrainian military, which has been trained directly by the West, provided with weapons, has really faltered. They've had to revert to much more primitive tactics. And actually, just this morning, Krystal, I was reading a piece about the Ukraine. I talk a lot here about one of the reasons why it's going to be so difficult for Ukraine. I always say they don't have any industrial base. Well, they actually confirmed it. In the year before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukraine did not produce one single artillery shell. Today, on the front line, they are using 90,000 shells per month. To put that in perspective, the United States, with the full power of its industrial base, produces 24,000 shells per month, which is actually 10,000 more than we were producing in 2022, which means that the overall number of shells that Ukraine consumes is some 4 to 5 times higher than the entire United States is able to produce per month. The Ukrainian ammunition chief even admits there is no way we will be able to produce that amount of shells,
wow,
quote, for years, which shows you that absent charity from all of the West, their military and war effort collapses effectively overnight. And Congress and the American people are at a point where we're like, we have done enough here. And I know this can sound very difficult, but people need to understand like the level of money that would be required to basically convert American industry to support the war in Ukraine would be astronomical, and it would be doing so for something which fundamentally is not of an actual core interest to the American people. So reality, I think, is really beginning to take its toll, both on the Ukrainian war effort sometime very soon in the future, but really in the minds of people who are looking at this and being like, look, it's been 19 months here, like we got to bring things to a close at some point.
I think it's remarkable, honestly, that you find these numbers where you now have a majority opposed to further aid, in spite of the fact that you have a really very consistent media narrative in favor of aid, always in favor of more hawkish action. So I do think it's always remarkable when you have the American people able to diverge with the consent that is attempting to be manufactured very heavily throughout mainstream outlets. So that's number one. Number two, the Democratic position here, it could seem a little perplexing on its face, where on the one hand, they're like, yes, absolutely, more aid. On the other hand, they're like, I'm pretty worried this is just going to continue forever. So on the one hand, you would think like, well, maybe you should consider that we should take a different approach. Maybe there's a different, tactic, since seems to be just continuing to draw out this conflict. But I think Democrats, more than any other group, they really do buy whatever the mainstream media line is, by and large, hook, line, and sinker. I mean, they have the highest levels of trust in mainstream media outlets. And that's basically the messaging that you get from corporate press, which is that, the way to bring this resolution to close, the correct action here is just to continue to support them, and maybe they're going to win and take back all the territory, and that's our best shot, and so that's what we should do. And of course, there's also a lot of partisan loyalty of just, all right, this is what Joe Biden says the right course of action is, so we trust our guy. So we believe that this is the best way to bring things to a close, even though it's hard to see how that's really going to happen. The other thing to note is, Democrats are fairly unified behind the Biden position. And I'm not just talking about elite Democrats who are 100% unified behind the Biden position, but the Democratic base fairly unified behind the Biden position. The Republicans have a pretty significant divide on their hands between what Republican elected elites and even many of their presidential contenders, and certainly the donor base, the policy that they support, versus the policy that now quite a significant majority of the Republican base supports. And this is, again, where, Donald Trump, who just positions himself wherever he thinks it's going to be politically advantageous on most issues. He doesn't really have a sort of like core belief. He just goes where his gut tells him is the right place to be, based on his political needs and interests. He really identified this split very early, and very early in the primary season. Previously, he'd sounded these extremely hawkish notes, being to the right and to the more hawkish side of Biden. He's gone back and forth and wavered, even within the primary. Occasionally, he goes back to that kind of rhetoric, but by and large, he intuited that there was this divide between where the Republican base was and where Republican elites were, and also intuited that that divide would continue to open up, and he positioned himself once again in the place that makes the most political sense for him.
Yeah, I mean, he actually did the same thing on Iraq. Remember, there was that whole thing. It was like, well, he said he supported it on Howard Stern in 2002, but no one can deny that he actually did turn against Iraq very early, like very early, I think in 2004. And just like Barack Obama, who genuinely was against the war from the very beginning, that was not a popular position at the time, but it ended up being a political savior in the long run. I also bet on that, frankly, in the future. I was like, listen, you guys can, put as many Ukraine flags in bio and out front of your house as long as you want, but great power conflict in a World War I style one always ends up basically catching up with reality, and that's basically where we find ourselves right now, which, it's I think it's sad because it's a terrible tragedy. Everything that we've been reading about Ukrainian casualties is a nightmare. I mean, they were not releasing their casualty figures, but even they are fully acknowledging that it is a very heavy loss. Inside Ukraine, actually, we're not hearing everything about what's happening. There have been very viral blog posts, Krystal, of Ukrainian military bloggers kind of reflecting the sentiments of the rank and file, who said that their commanders are throwing them into the grinder with absolutely no concern for their lives. And these things are going very viral. So, I mean, inside Ukraine, think about it. Like, when you've got 90,000 people in a pretty small country, against relative to the U.S., who have lost limbs, at that point, you all know somebody who's been wounded on the front line.
Yeah.
You may probably be connected to someone who has lost their life and has been killed. Things start to get very real once you get to that level of death and of wounded in the population. This happened, I keep coming back to the First World War. It's a very instructive thing. I mean, we had almost a near revolution in France after millions of Frenchmen were wounded or killed on the front line, where they effectively demanded, they're like, look, we got to bring this, we got to completely change tactics and all that. And it's also the revolution in 1918 in Germany, which was really like a ground up revolution against the conditions imposed on by the war, which brought down the entire Kaiser regime. So look, if you let these things go on long enough, who the hell knows what's going to happen? Russian revolution also, of course. And I would say, like, let's avoid that scenario as much as possible, because it's not like everything worked out for the better when that happened.
Yeah, certainly.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.